The law that helps nobody but the oil companies. Why RA 8479 must go and what should replace it. The Philippines imports almost everything it burns. We produce a negligible amount of crude domestically. The Galloc oil field off Palawan, our only active producing field, was averaging roughly 1,000 to 1,300 barrels per day as of 2023, a number that keeps declining. Compare that to the roughly 170 million barrels of crude oil and petroleum products we import every year. We are a small country at the end of a very long supply chain, completely at the mercy of decisions made in Riyadh, Washington, and the Strait of Hormuz. That is a structural reality no president, no law, and no protest can change overnight. But here is the part that should make you angry. Knowing all of that, knowing we have zero leverage over global oil markets, knowing our peso takes a beating every time the dollar strengthens, knowing we import virtually everything we use, the country still passed a law in 1998 that also took away whatever domestic tools the government had left to protect us when things go wrong. That law is Republic Act 8479, the Downstream Oil Industry Deregulation Act. After 28 years, it deserves retirement, but only together with a smarter replacement, not just louder outrage. Where it came from. Before RA 8479, the Philippines had the Oil Price Stabilization Fund, the OPSF, a government buffer created by Marcos Sr. in 1984 through Presidential Decree 1956. Oil companies were supposed to contribute to the fund when global prices dropped below the regulated price and draw from it when prices spiked above the ceiling. The goal was simple: shield consumers from sudden price surges by letting the state absorb the worst of the shock. On paper, that idea made sense. In practice, it turned into a political piggy bank. Politicians kept delaying mandated price increases because higher pump prices are never popular. The deficit piled up. By 1990, Congress had to bail out the OPSF with a 5 billion peso emergency appropriation from the national budget. In 1992, Republic Act 7639 redirected 3 billion pesos in OPSF funds to pay for National Power Corporation capital stock. Money meant to buffer oil prices instead went to a different state enterprise. Chronic mismanagement, political abuse, and structural flaws eventually defined the fund. When President Fidel Ramos came in with his Philippines 2000 agenda, pushing liberalization and deregulation across sectors, and when the IMF attached oil deregulation as a conditionality to a 1994 extended fund facility loan, the OPSF's record made repeal an easy sell. A first version of the deregulation law, RA 8180, was struck down by the Supreme Court on December 3, 1997. The court found 3 provisions that actually encouraged monopoly and restraint of trade, the opposite of what a deregulation measure was supposed to promote. Congress rewrote the law. RA 8479 was signed on February 10, 1998. The goals placed on paper looked reasonable: stabilize prices through market competition, break the big 3 oligopoly of Petron, Shell, and Caltex, attract new investors into the oil sector, and remove distorting subsidies. Economic managers described their push for deregulation in a world of stable crude prices and a stronger peso, betting that more players would translate into lower prices for everyone. Then the Asian financial crisis hit. The peso collapsed. Whatever stable conditions had been assumed vanished almost overnight. What the law was supposed to do versus what it actually did. The central promise of RA 8479 rested on a familiar line: let competition work and prices will find a fair level. More players, more competition, lower margins, better deals for consumers. That chain never fully formed in the Philippines. The oligopoly didn't break at the infrastructure level. After deregulation, independent players did enter the retail market, Phoenix Petroleum and Sea Oil among the notable ones, and by 2021, independents had grown to more than 60% of petroleum product volumes by market share. Pump-level competition improved. More brands, more stations, more options for motorists. Infrastructure tells a different story. New entrants arrived as importers, not refiners. No new oil refinery has been built since deregulation. Caltex shut its Batangas refinery in September 2003. Shell permanently closed its Tabangao refinery in August 2020 and converted it into an import terminal. Petron's Baton facility now operates as the country's only remaining refinery. In other words, diversity exists at the forecourt, but control still sits with a small handful of firms that own refineries, import terminals, and bulk storage. Independent importers buy from the same global supply chain at roughly the same time, and at broadly similar prices, so none of them can protect consumers when global crude spikes. They simply pass the shock on. Prices do not move like prices in a healthy competitive market. When global crude prices rise, all major firms raise pump prices almost in lockstep. When global prices fall, rollbacks tend to come later and in smaller amounts, with some of the gap kept as extra margin. The Philippine Competition Commission's 2021 market study confirmed what consumers have felt for years. The largest firms retain structural advantages through logistics infrastructure and supply chains that smaller players cannot match. In a 2026 hearing, Representative Miro Quimbo summed up the situation in one line: "No one is regulating their income because it's a free market." The long-term price record tells its own story. Based on figures compiled by transport group Piston from historical price data, diesel in March 1998, $8.10 per liter. By January 2025, $57.81. That amounts to a 714% increase. Gasoline in March 1998, 11.62 per liter. By January 2025, $65.41. That amounts to a 563% increase. Then came March 2026. Conflict widening in the Middle East sent global crude into a fresh surge, and a fully deregulated Philippine downstream sector passed on the shock without any meaningful buffer. A single-week price adjustment reached up to $38.50 per liter in combined hikes, with projections that diesel could breach 130 cents per liter if trends held. Piston reported jeepney drivers spending up to 60% of daily earnings on fuel. The real problem: we took away our own tools. Any honest conversation begins with this: global oil prices set the tone for what Filipinos pay at the pump. That is a structural fact for an import-dependent country. When the Strait of Hormuz closes, when war breaks out in a producing region, when OPEC cuts output, waves will hit local prices no matter what Malacanang prefers. Yet vulnerability and helplessness are not the same condition. RA 8479 moved the country closer to helplessness by design. The law removed the Department of Energy's power to intervene in local pricing. It also outlawed unfair or unreasonable prices without defining those terms in operational, measurable ways. In effect, no clear threshold exists to trigger a government response. When the DOE attempted to force companies to disclose full cost breakdowns, crude, refining, logistics, and margins, the move stalled after legal challenges and resistance from industry. When the Russia-Ukraine war jolted global prices in 2022, government response fell back on targeted subsidies and appeals for voluntary restraint. Current DOE Secretary Sharon Garand has acknowledged the limits in blunt terms. In a March 2026 interview, she explained that the department is constrained by the law and the deregulation. "We do not have the powers to cap or to control the prices." In one sentence, the country's lead energy regulator admitted that the legal framework took away key tools for crisis response. Every oil importing country lives with global price swings. Not every oil importing country chooses to face those swings with almost no domestic policy instruments left on the table. The Philippines made that choice in 1998 and kept doubling down on it. Why nobody has fixed it in 28 years? If RA 8479 has such a poor record, why has it stayed untouched for nearly 3 decades? 3 forces keep it in place. First, the state now leans heavily on fuel-related tax revenue. In 2025 discussions, customs and finance officials warned that suspending fuel excise taxes and VAT could cost the government somewhere between $136 billion and $330 billion in a single year, depending on scope and timing. That money pays for a long list of programs. Any administration that seriously entertains reform must answer a follow-up question: what replaces that revenue stream? So far, no one has wanted to walk into that fight. Second, oil companies sit close to the political center of gravity. Petron belongs to the San Miguel Group, one of the country's largest and most politically connected conglomerates. Other major players also sit inside business empires with deep links into politics and media. These are actors that can hire the best lawyers, shape public narratives, and wait out any administration that moves too slowly. Previous attempts to amend RA 8479 or restore limited regulation either died quietly in committee or moved in one chamber and stalled in the other. Third, the investment climate card appears whenever reform momentum builds. PIDS, the state think tank, has repeatedly warned that revisiting deregulation could send the wrong signal to foreign investors, who might read it as a sign that the Philippines changes rules mid-game. In principle, that concern has weight. Investors do care about regulatory predictability. In practice, the same argument now functions as a veto. Every effort to design stronger consumer protection mechanisms in the energy sector runs into warnings about spooking investors, and the conversation shuts down. A small, open economy with negligible crude production needs foreign capital and stable rules. It also needs a functioning framework for a commodity that underpins food prices, transport costs, and basic mobility. Pretending those needs are mutually exclusive solves nothing. The case for repeal, with eyes open. Calls to repeal RA 8479 have been around for years. Some come from groups opposed to deregulation on principle, others from consumers pushed beyond their breaking point by each new wave of price hikes. Straight repeal on its own does not solve much. The OPSF era offers a clear warning: a stabilization fund managed inside the usual political cycle, with no independent oversight, no hard rules for activation, and no protection from diversion, ultimately sank under its own contradictions. That experience explains why technocrats flinch whenever Bring Back the OPSF appears on the table. Their hesitation stands on solid ground. The better path is to treat the OPSF as a set of lessons rather than a model to resurrect. A modern replacement framework needs three core pillars: a new law with teeth. The next law governing the downstream oil industry should focus on targeted powers rather than blanket control. 1. Emergency price ceilings with clear triggers. The DOE should have the legal authority to declare an energy price emergency and impose temporary retail price caps when specific conditions are met. For example, when global crude prices breach a certain level for a defined number of days, or when cumulative pump price increases cross a percentage threshold within a given period. Those conditions should be written into the statute itself, leaving less room for political whim, and making both government and industry aware of the rules long before any crisis hits. 2. Statutory price unbundling. Every company selling petroleum products in the Philippines should be required by law to publish on a regular schedule the itemized components of its prices: crude acquisition cost, refining or import cost, transport and logistics, dealer margin, and corporate margin. Consumers, journalists, and regulators would gain a basic X-ray of how much they pay for each layer. Cost components that suddenly diverge from trends would be far easier to spot and challenge. 3. Quantified anti-profiteering standards. Vague bans on unreasonable or unjust pricing invite non-enforcement. A modern law should define a reasonable band for margins based on transparent cost references. Margins that shoot significantly beyond that band over a defined period would automatically trigger review and potential penalties. The aim is not blanket price control, but a system that sets red lines for profiteering when markets are tight. Reform isn't theoretical anymore. HB 8766 and SB 1984. The ideas above are already finding their way into draft legislation. On March 25, 2026, ACT Teachers Rep. Antonio Tinio, Gabriela Women's Party Rep. Sarah Jane Ilago, and Cabaton Rep. Renee Louise Coe filed House Bill 8766, titled An Act Regulating the Downstream Petroleum Industry, repealing Republic Act No. 8479. The bill repeals RA 8479, creates a Petroleum Price Regulatory Council with authority to approve or deny proposed price adjustments after public hearings, and requires price unbundling and detailed inventory and cost reporting, giving the council power to stop hikes that cannot be justified by disclosed costs. Alongside it, the same bloc filed HB 8765 to amend the Price Act so fuel explicitly counts as a prime commodity, making it possible to impose price ceilings during emergencies even while RA 8479 technically still stands. In the Senate, the move no longer comes only from the left. Senate President Vicente Sotto III filed SB 1984, also seeking repeal of the oil deregulation law. When Makabayan and the Senate President, two actors who rarely share policy space, both push toward repeal, that convergence reveals how weak the status quo has become. These bills still need committee hearings, amendments, and votes, but at minimum they show that an alternative architecture is no longer just a thought experiment. An independent petroleum regulatory commission. Any replacement regime that relies only on the DOE's existing structure risks another cycle of overpromising and under-enforcing. Cabinet agencies, by design, operate under political pressure. They respond to the sitting president, the budget process, and shifting coalitions in Congress. A more credible design would place core oversight responsibilities in an independent petroleum regulatory commission. The body could be modeled structurally on the Energy Regulatory Commission, but with a narrower, more focused mandate. Key design points. Commissioners serve fixed terms and can be removed only for clear, legally defined cause. An independent panel screens nominees based on technical competence and track record. A fixed percentage of fuel excise revenue flows automatically to the Commission's budget, reducing the risk of funding cuts being used as leverage. Methodologies for computing allowable price adjustments and margins are published, accessible, and open to scrutiny. Decisions are appealable to the courts, not to the executive branch. Structured this way, a regulator gains enough distance from both politicians and industry to make hard calls when they matter most. HB 8766's proposed council already moves in this direction. The real fight, if it progresses, will revolve around how independent that body truly becomes once lawmakers finish editing the bill. A self-financing strategic buffer fund. Price regulation alone cannot carry the weight of shielding consumers from global shocks. A strategic buffer adds another layer of protection. A strategic petroleum buffer fund could draw from a fixed slice of fuel excise taxes and activate only when certain legal triggers are met. Once triggered, the fund would pay for temporary per-liter discounts or targeted subsidies at the retail level, with both the amount and duration set by statute. The law could cap maximum annual exposure to protect fiscal stability. Two safeguards matter most: constitutional or quasi-constitutional protection against diversion to non-energy uses, so OPSF-style raids for unrelated projects become far more difficult. Full transparency. Regular publication of fund balances, inflows, and outflows, so the public can see exactly how much is being collected and how it is being used. Models exist. Malaysia's pricing mechanisms and Thailand's oil fund offer regional examples of how governments can smooth shocks without locking in permanent subsidies. The point is not to copy them wholesale, but to stop pretending the Philippines needs to reinvent the concept from scratch. Why Marcos has a once-in-a-generation opening. The 2026 Middle East crisis achieved in weeks what 2 decades of technical papers and sectoral statements could not. It placed fuel price pain at the center of public attention. The shock has touched jeepney drivers and private motorists, grocery prices and delivery riders, small businesses and salaried employees. Everyone now feels, in daily life, what deregulation looks like in a fully import-dependent country. President Marcos Jr. has publicly said that repealing the oil deregulation law is not off the table. On March 24, 2026, he signed Executive Order 110 declaring a state of national energy emergency and directing the DOE to safeguard supply and address price issues. The executive branch now openly acknowledges that the current situation requires extraordinary measures. Yet the same statement that opens the door to reform also reveals hesitation. The president has emphasized the need for long discussions and careful study, while DOE officials repeatedly point to legal constraints under RA 8479. The underlying choice remains unresolved. Does this administration intend to rebuild a regulatory framework that can manage crises, or will it settle for temporary subsidies while the structure stays intact? There is also a historical echo that cannot be ignored. Marcos Sr. created the OPSF in 1984. Ramos, under IMF pressure and liberalization fervor, took the country down the path to deregulation that killed it. Marcos Jr. now stands in a position to close that loop, not by returning to his father's model, but by building something his father's era never had: a transparent, rules-based, independently overseen system for managing a strategic commodity. Few presidents get that kind of opportunity. The honest bottom line: global oil markets will never sit under Philippine control. That fact will not change no matter how many bills Congress passes or how many speeches Malacanang delivers. What can change is how nakedly those global swings cut into daily life. RA 8479 took a country that already depended almost entirely on imported oil and removed most of the domestic instruments that could have softened inevitable blows. Retail-level competition did expand, particularly through independent importers, but the infrastructure that really shapes pricing, refineries, import terminals, bulk storage, stayed concentrated in the hands of a few firms. Consumers now live at the intersection of global volatility, peso weakness, and a domestic legal regime that tells regulators to mostly stand back. A small oil-importing country with negligible domestic production, a fragile currency, and deep poverty has no business living under a framework that strips its government of basic crisis management tools for energy. That approach serves the balance sheets of firms that can pass on costs instantly and completely. It hardly serves the jeepney driver trying to stretch a day's earnings, the market vendor watching transport costs climb, or the commuter who has no alternative to higher fares. Repealing RA 8479 on its own will not magically lower prices or insulate the Philippines from the next war or embargo. Repeal paired with a hard-headed replacement, independent regulation, transparent cost breakdowns, clear anti-profiteering rules, and a properly designed buffer fund gives the country a fighting chance to stop making a bad situation worse. The ideas exist. Draft laws now exist. The question left on the table is the same one that hangs over every crisis in this country: whether those in power will use the tools in front of them, or once again choose to ride out the storm and leave the structure untouched.